You're listening to Indications by the Conference Board. This podcast was recorded on January 28th, before the events in Ukraine unfolded. Enjoy.
Welcome to the Conference Board's Indications podcast. Indications is a public podcast featuring our global roster of thought leaders. Topics range from economic growth and competitiveness to human capital, governance, sustainability, and beyond. Each episode is a serious conversation grounded in data and insights that will keep you ahead of the curve in a turbulent world. I am here with a very special guest, retired Rear Admiral John Polowczyk, to discuss the future of global supply chains, Part 2. Retired Rear Admiral John Polowczyk is a managing director at Ernst & Young, where he advises government and commercial clients on supply chains and logistics. Previously, Rear Admiral Polowczyk served as the White House supply chain lead on the coronavirus task force to stabilize the supply chain during the pandemic. A career supply chain and logistics professional with 35 plus years of experience, Rear Admiral Polowczyk also served as the Vice Director for Logistics to the Chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff. He holds a Bachelor's in Science in Engineering from the United States Naval Academy, a Master's in Science in Acquisition and Contracting from the United States Naval Postgraduate School, and a Master's in Science in Public Policy from the National Defense University. Welcome, Rear Admiral. It's a pleasure to meet you.
Morning, Dan. Thanks for having me today. I appreciate the invitation.
Thank you so much for joining us. So let's begin the conversation. During the pandemic, a topic that only inventory managers fretted over became a breakfast table conversation: supply chains. Why are supply chains a huge topic now, and why should businesses care about them?
Yeah, so Dana, having been a supply chain professional for 34 years in the Navy, we always made it seem like magic. Things just showed up. You had what you need, right? And now with the pandemic, it was the first time I think that many people sat there and wondered, why isn't this available on the grocery store shelf? What do you mean we don't have toilet paper? Why isn't there eggs on the shelf? So it just gave the pandemic and the disruptions to the workforce, to the supply chains, and really to some degree the chain in the supply chain, the transportation. It gave people the real first opportunity to say, how does all this work? And companies, global companies have spent decades leaning out their supply chains to take cost out, especially in the medical side. I tell you, the pandemic really exposed some weaknesses on lean supply chains and the lack of inventory as safety stock levels. Of course, there were some, right? I can't blame everything on that aspect. But really, when you just care, I want my 20-cent mask. I'm a doctor in a hospital. I just want my 20-cent mask, and I don't care where it comes from, and I don't care how it's managed. The end result is when you have major perturbations, major shocks to the global economy, you end up not having your mask.
So you mentioned the economy. How exactly are supply chain disruptions affecting growth, prices, and central bank policies?
Well, I'm not an economist. My background is I'm an acquisition professional within the Department of Defense. Really, that means I'm trained and versed in the business skills to buy things for the department. I've also been a comptroller, so I've managed billion-dollar budgets for major activities, and I'm a supply chain person, so there's a lot of business acumen in there, right? But I think what the pandemic did was, these major disruptions, pent up demand. I spent on the COVID task force. I spent the first couple of weeks trying to understand national supply and national demand. And when demand is 3-4 times supply, the economic models in any textbook will tell you price is going to go up, right? And so people went home, people had extra money in their pocket, And so, you had all of these pressures. You had a lack of transportation. So there was just pressures in the market that drove these factors. To give you an example, we had to work with the government of Malaysia to get their factory workers in the nitrile glove industry um, back into work, even though they had COVID, they being the country of Malaysia, and they were doing the same things that we were, but we were so dependent on that stream of value stream from Malaysia to the U.S. to have exam gloves to protect healthcare workers, right? And so that workforce disruption, that transportation disruption, just made prices and things go up. So the global economy, all of that churn, workers aren't working, things aren't being made. Yeah, it's nothing. It's nothing short of classic economic models that just take those pressures and prices raise, et cetera, et cetera. So it's not I don't have the world's best answer, but from somebody who is trying to manage the national supply chain and get more for healthcare workers, these pressures were real.
Indeed. And that's exactly what, we're seeing on our side. So with all of this, with supply chains, how does the concept of sustainability also, play into the mix? Certainly businesses, as you said, have made supply chains, very lean and efficient, but we've learned during the pandemic that they weren't really sustainable in terms of having that leanness, and just in time properties to them. So what are your thoughts around that?
Yeah. So I explain it kind of this way. The traditional model is kind of what you just said there. It's lean, not a lot of inventory held because that's cash. The linear aspect of it, in search of cheap manufacturing labor, all of those ills in the network design, those 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 things, and along with geographic or vendor concentration, all of these things led to the supply chains disruption. And so companies are rethinking this lean, cost optimized, geographic concentration, vendor concentration. People are going to, really working now at alternate sources of supply. Is it right that I'm wholly dependent on a certain geographic area? Should I have some more inventory levels at all echelons? And I could, the examples I kind of give is back in the beginning of the pandemic in 2020 for the medical supply chain. Hospitals really didn't have large warehouses worth of things attached to them. They, for the most part, relied on daily deliveries from the distribution network. Those distribution networks had a couple of months worth of supply at normal demand, but when demand goes up 300 to 400%, those couple of months really aren't there. States didn't have large stockpiles. The federal government had the national stockpile, right? So this just-in-time inventory and not having what I will call echelons of supply, right? People are rethinking that. Global companies are rethinking that, and rethinking, do I concentrate? I didn't like what happened in the pandemic because I was concentrated manufacturing in a geographic area. Do I change that? Right. So there right now people companies are relooking, national governments are relooking all of these interdependencies. And I'm not one to say that we're going to walk back 30, 40, 50 years of globalization in a year, in 5 years. But I would imagine this topic of sustainability, this topic of supply chains, there's gonna be changes over the next years, decade, as we sort out I didn't like what happened during the pandemic, and how might I make myself more resilient to other shocks? I mean, just continue to pick up the newspaper or turn on the TV. There's plenty of news that makes you wonder, okay, well, I wonder how that's going to turn out.
So you mentioned that there's this concentration in locations of supply chain. So it seems like there's a very serious imbalance in the distribution. So, what about industrial policies? Because you also mentioned that governments are looking very seriously at this. So if you can just explain to the average person, what are industrial policies and how do they apply to supply chains?
Right. And so I can dive into the US a little bit. I've had several different sessions with staff members of different congressional committees that are all trying to understand how to make the US supply chains more resilient. And really, coming from the Department of Defense, where we care deeply about the defense industrial base, DIB, the Defense Industrial Base, nobody cares about building nuclear submarines than the Navy. And so that there's just teams of people working to understand the livelihood and the capabilities and capacity in that defense industrial base to keep pace with technology, to keep pace with the capacities needed to build submarines, etc. I think you get the sense that somebody's actively managing the industrial base. On the medical side, for example, when I got over into the task force and started to work with Health and Human Services, and again, apolitical here, a naval officer just got grabbed from the Pentagon to go, work in this environment. I'm not faulting the administration. It was this way for decades. Health and Human Services did not have the same bandwidth, the same staffing, the same ideas to manage a medical industrial base. So there wasn't a federal presence to understand we understand we're wholly reliant on Asia for most, I won't say all, but a lot of medical products. Is that good or bad? Should we have a national effort to ensure that we're resilient and can support ourselves? There's some of that, but not to the active degree, right? So as you look at every cabinet secretary, even the Secretary of Agriculture came to me during the pandemic, and I had to help the Secretary of Agriculture manage supply chains to get workers back into meat packing plants, etc. Active management. And so many of these legislations and many of the discussions that you see are the federal government trying to figure out in this case, the people that I'm talking to is Congress, so it's the legislative branch, are trying to figure out. You hear words like decoupling from Asia, from China. Is that right? What would we do? What should we do? And many of the legislations are looking to put somebody in charge of the supply chains at a national level, whether it's in the Department of Homeland Security for national economic prosperity and security, whether it's in the Department of Commerce. And so I think over the coming years, you're going to see successive amounts of legislation and things done to understand what is the role of the federal government in providing an understanding of national capability and capacity, especially in manufacturing in critical sectors. No, I'm not going to tell you what a critical sector is today, but I would imagine medical is probably a critical sector. Probably microelectronics might be another critical sector, right? But somebody's got to prioritize, and then the legislation and the resources behind those things. I mentioned decoupling from Asia. Is it all of that? Does it have to be made all in the United States, or is Canada okay? Is Central America okay? Is someplace in this hemisphere? I think you're going to see years of conversation, but I think immediately I think you're going to see somebody in the federal government whose primary responsibility is to understand these interdependencies of supply chains across sectors, and do we have the right capabilities and capacity to manufacture, manage supply chains for economic security and prosperity. It's a long answer, but it's a really difficult, complex topic.
Makes sense. So it sounds like, in terms of the reasons for industrial policies, it's around, not just only being ready for the next pandemic or the next health crisis, but security, economic security, potentially making sure that we're not held hostage to foreign governments in terms of supplying much needed items, and also diversification, right? Instead of just being mainly reliant on one region, we spread the risk, if you will. So, I mean, can you talk a little bit more deeply in terms of what the benefits versus the costs of these industrial policies?
Well, I think as we work with global companies, and there are some themes that come out, and geographic concentrations, working on alternate sources, figuring out where and how you should have manufacturing and distribution networks. There are a few other themes that come out. Traditionally, firms concentrated on their first, second tier supply chains. So the first tier is the guy I get the end product from, and the second tier is the people that are supplying to the first tier, et cetera. But really, to understand how resilient are you or not, you almost have to get all the way down to the raw material. So case in point, from my work at the task force, when we started to have the conversation over, once we figured out national demand, so to speak, for N95 masks, which that number was about 280 million a month. U.S. made about 30 million in prior to March of 2020. So we had to expand the U.S. manufacturing just umpteen times to get to 280 million from 30. And that took a dive of what goes in an N95 mask, down to the plastic pellet that's spun into the non-woven fabric that makes the cloth for the mask, along with the elastic that gets sewn on to make give you something to hold it onto your face, right? That's a very simple example, but the task force had to dive down to understand every piece of that, make more plastic, make more elastic, get more. Same thing when we bought 230,000 ventilators. We used the Defense Production Act not only on the purchase of the ventilators, but all the way down the supply chain. We had to unkink it for components, small motors, filters. That's the downstream visibility, the end-to-end visibility of the supply chain. So that resiliency piece, and how connected, and all the way down to, I don't want to say the petroleum product or the rare earth element that goes into a microelectronic, but you're seeing global firms wanting an end-to-end visibility so they can really understand their supply chains and not leave it to chance.
Thank you. So it seems like visibility is a huge benefit to exploring these industrial policies. As an economist, I'd say, yes, that's awesome. But then there are also costs in terms of, shrinking global growth, right? In terms of less trade. But, there has to be a balance somewhere in there where, you're not sacrificing that visibility and availability of inventory, in order to fully save trade. So very interesting things here. I mean, did you want to mention anything in terms of?
Yeah, no, Dan, I think you're hitting on why this is going to be so hard, and why it's going to take so much time. Look, the American consumer has benefited from the globalization and this trade between nations, where the price of things. I just think of a price. I'm always amazed at the price of a television. Wow, I mean, I can remember when something half that size or less capability was a lot more expensive. And so I think that pressure to continue to provide low cost products will always be there. And so as companies try to work through these very difficult decisions of where do I do the manufacturing? How do I do it in a manner where I'm not wholly reliant on one area, but I want to keep I want to access low cost labor to keep the price sensitivity, et cetera, et cetera. I think these things are going to take time to sort out. I would imagine some choose to continue on, some choose to make changes, and I think that you'll see some unraveling and growth in areas in other nations. There is some. I think the global pharmaceutical firms, some are sitting here looking. Well, maybe I need manufacturing and distribution for North America, the Americas. Maybe I just need it. Maybe I need it. It's the same kind of concept for Europe, and maybe I do stuff in China and it just stays in China, right? I mean, so there are very difficult conversations that are going on that national governments and not just the United States, but national governments are all looking at this within this somewhat in the same vein of how do I manage this now? What are the things that I need to do? Levers of national power, tax, tariff, etc., to incentivize resiliency in supply chains for economic security and prosperity. But realizing that the unraveling of globalization is going to take decades.
As war rages in Ukraine, the Conference Board is closely monitoring the situation and producing timely and relevant content on a daily basis that will help the business community navigate this global geopolitical unrest. What will the impact be on oil prices, food prices, our supply chain, and what about cybersecurity? How will this conflict impact the way your organization does business around the world, and how will you communicate this crisis to customers and employees? We're gathering the very latest content on our website. Just head to conference-board.org and find trusted insights to help you and your team lead with confidence.
So I just have two more quick questions for you. So what is the future of transportation in terms of making physical supply chains more robust?
Yeah, so transportation was something that was, I think, had always been somewhat assumed, and I think the pandemic showed, boy, we really do need truck drivers. I think the pandemic showed that we have. It's not just ports; it's the infrastructure, it's the railways, it's the warehouses, it's the chain in the supply chain. There'll always be the physics problem of getting it from A to B. But we tend to do that. That tends to be the easy part. The ship moves from A to B. It's where you make those transitions from different modes to multimodal aspect of it. It's that area, and so I do think some of this area people are looking at technology in the transportation realm. And really, I think it's the digitization of the information and the ability to help cargo move through the network and not make every one of these places where it goes from ship to rail to truck to warehouse to back to some other mode, that doesn't become the kink in the supply chain. And there's many people taking a look at technology, software, planning. I think you're going to see a growth in those areas to help alleviate and manage shocks in the system. So I think there is a technology piece that can become in play here and help. Now, I will also tell you, when I see things like William Shatner take a space ride, and I'm not promoting either space vehicle, but I do wonder if the next delivery method might be from space. And as one of those joint logistics planners in DoD, I do take note that it might be interesting what we could do with a distribution network from space. So what took days, hours, might take minutes. And so I'm not saying that's ready for commercial prime time, but as I see some of those events, I just kind of go, interesting. That might be the few piece of transportation that's not here yet, but might be being developed in front of our eyes.
That's truly fascinating. I'm just imagining that, a product going from Earth to the stratosphere and then coming back down in minutes and being at my front door. That's super
Or
exciting.
being, so you pay for overnight air now, right? So I look at what I had to do with Project Airbridge during the pandemic. I had to convince the medical supply chain to reorientate their transportation network from the very cost efficient maritime to air. And of course, as a federal government, we had to pay for that to move product quicker and beat the 30-day, almost 40-day cycle time from loading it in Asia, floating it over, unloading it, getting on rail and trucks, etc. We paid for air. Maybe at some point, the most expeditious manner will be you pay for a space delivery as the most rapid method. So I just, who knows where that go.
Awesome. Last and final question. This is a little bit different because most of what we've talked about was in terms of goods. So, how will supply chains adapt to the delivery of services as we look to the future?
I don't think we're ever going back strictly brick and mortar. Um, I think what you saw during the pandemic was just an impetus for immense change. The e-delivery, you could buy, you could have, prior to the pandemic, you had folks that were already buying groceries online and getting them delivered, but now the online presence and the e presence, I just don't see it going back, just because of the ease of it, and people are just like, why do I have to go do this? And so I think the delivery, I think you're still going to see massive change there and disruption in it. I say that, but really, some of the themes that come out of when firms go look at resiliency, they think about omni-channel networks, and really multiple ways for them and customers to interact to be able to get product delivered to the end user. And so, like geographic diversity, you know, or lack of geographic diversity, only having one channel is probably not going to cut it either. And everything cannot be, reliant on generically the internet. Pick up the newspaper this morning, and the issues that are going on in Europe, with two global competitors staring at each other over a country. A lot of things may be happening in cyber that we don't even see, and so a lot of things might be happening in space that we don't see. And so I just don't think that wholly reliant on one delivery method will be the answer either. But I do see that, yeah, we're never going back to having to go to a brick and mortar or something to get there. That transformation will continue.
Well, Rear Admiral, it's been an honor and a pleasure speaking with you. Thank you so much for such a great conversation.
Thanks, Dana. I appreciate being invited from the person who got pulled from the Pentagon, having to manage a national supply chain. I'm not a medical supply chain person, so to speak, but many of the issues that you brought up today were front and center on trying to figure out how to build more national capacity in manufacturing and distribution, to help solve the pandemic issues. I was the first vestiges of Operation Warp Speed. I handed that off to General Perna to help lead the vaccine effort. But this topic of supply chain resiliency, national efforts, it's going to be in front of us for years.
Thank you, Rear Admiral, again. This has been Indications from the Conference Board. If you enjoyed this podcast, you may listen to additional The Conference Board offerings by going to www.conference-board.org/podcasts or find us wherever you listen to podcasts. Thanks again for listening.
If the topics covered in this podcast interest you, you can learn more during our virtual event on April 21st. Responsible and Resilient Supply Chain Management. Go to our website at conference-board.org and register today.